When I was a little kid back on the ranch, we learned a bit of Spanish in school. In elementary school, we had a lady from Ecuador who taught us how to say jirafa and hipopótamo. That's giraffe and hippopotamus, in case you're wondering. Even then, I strongly suspected that learning the names of African animals in a foreign language was probably not the best use of my time. Besides, the teacher made us all use Spanglicized names. Of course, Daniel is a perfectly acceptable name in Spanish. It's pretty common internationally as well, but I didn't know that. So, Mrs. What's-Her-Name, the Ecuadorian, insisted on calling me Donito. Donito. Sounds like a corn chip more than a person. My tiny 8-year-old brain drew some conclusions from all of this. Specifically, I decided that I hated Spanish, and probably the whole culture it was attached to. My introduction to Spanish cuisine came later. In high school, they taught us about more practical things, and I decided that I didn't hate Spanish after all. One thing we learned and were tested on was a list of foods. Eventually, I came to Spain at age 21, which is a long story in itself, but I thought I knew what I would be getting into, both linguistically and food-wise. I knew how to say naranja, after all, as well as zanahoria, carne, and chocolate. My first surprise, fresh off the plane, was that they don't eat Mexican food in Spain. Pardon my provincial ignorance, please, but I ate Mexican food about 4 times a week back in Arizona, and just assumed that the whole world worked on a one-language, one-cuisine system. The fact that they didn't have chimichangas or enchiladas everywhere in Madrid was a bit of a shock. Then I started going to typical old man bars with my classmates at my English teacher certification, and found that I often didn't understand anything on the menu. I was a vegetarian at the time, so most of my focus was on avoiding meat rather than actually enjoying what I ate. And in the process, I'd have these surreal conversations with waiters. ¿Eso tiene carne? I would say. No, no tiene carne. Solo cerdo. Ah, I see. So no meat, only pork, which, according to my definition, is also meat. I tried explaining, I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat meat. But that also got me nowhere. At best, they'd offer me some fish, which is, according to the Spanish folk wisdom, also not meat. But, of course, if you're a vegetarian, it is meat. So what's a guy to do? I tried saying, nada de animales. That might have worked a few times. And I learned. Slowly, and with the help of a big Vox dictionary that I would carry everywhere in my messenger bag, I learned about Spanish cuisine. I'm Daniel Welsh. This is Spain to Go. Welcome back to the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. This is episode 30. It is entitled Spanish Cuisine, a Love Story. Or, if you would like a longer version, Spanish Cuisine, an ex-vegetarian falls in love with jamón and chorizo. It's going to be a nice ride here. We're going to talk about my transition from vegetarian to omnivore, with the help, of course, of some Spanish girlfriends, Spanish friends, and the deliciousness of Spanish cuisine. So, back to the word carne. Carne apparently wasn't exactly meat as I'd been taught in school. In practice, it was usually used for beef, so a dish with no carne could easily have pork. One could, of course, be more specific. Carne de ternera for beef and carne de cerdo for pork. But I didn't know that, and an overworked, underpaid bar waiter is hardly the person to ask for a lesson in Spanish food vocabulary. Wandering the streets of Madrid during that first dark, freezing winter, I also learned that things like un sándwich vegetal are not vegetarian at all. Apparently, vegetal means it contains a slice of tomato, not that it's vegetarian. A sandwich vegetal usually has some flaked tuna, lettuce, tomato, mayonnaise, and possibly an egg. The tuna made it decidedly not vegetarian. Lonely, cold, and far from home, I ate a lot of cheese sandwiches and tortilla de patatas. That's a Spanish potato omelet, and wondered why I was so depressed. It never occurred to me that I was just undernourished. Searching for a bit of warmth in my life, I tried dating some Spanish girls, but that was often little help. For one thing, they couldn't get their heads around my vegetarianism. My grandfather ate nothing but onions for a whole winter during the 1940s, and you come here and won't even try jamón serrano. It's an insult to Spanishness. That was Maria number 1, the first in a proud line of girls named Maria that I dated. She was pretty nice, but also realistic about how our relationship had no future. She was from one of the wealthier suburbs, and at one point explained to me that she usually only dated guys who owned cars. In Spain, that's sometimes shorthand for can borrow dad's car as needed, but the point was made. She wanted to make out in a Citroën in the Corte Inglés parking lot, and all I had was a room with a twin bed in a shared flat down by the river. After a few months, she dumped me. Not because of the car thing, but because I was generally a miserable, depressing person to be around. The second Spanish girl I dated, we could call her Maria number 2, dumped me for a similar reason. Apparently, I was negative about everything, always. Those were basically her words. Oh well. She was young, also rich, well, family rich, and wildly attractive, so she probably would have ruined my life somehow, given time. I had a job by that point, but due to the extreme seasonality and badly paid nature of the teaching English as a foreign language game, could only afford to pay around 300 euros a month in rent. Not easy to find, even back in 2006. I ended up living in Vallecas, a working-class suburb whose very name sent chills down the spines of the sort of girls I'd been dating. Luckily, though, I'd recently met Maria number 3 at the anarchist book fair. She didn't have a problem with my new neighborhood. Well, maybe she did. She never saw it. She lived in Valencia, so most of the time I'd go out there to see her. I know. Mr. Chorizo picking up girls at the anarchist book fair. Always a class act. But what can I say? I'm a man of many facets. And at one point in my life, one of those facets was drawn to radical politics. Mostly, I think, because I'd been scraping along below the poverty line for several years at that point and didn't find adult life in a capitalist society to be very promising. And anyway, I wasn't yet Mr. Chorizo at that point. I was still eating vegetarian. If you'd known me back then, you probably would have called me Mr. Zanahoria. That would be Mr. Carrot, if you prefer. But finally, one time out in Valencia, I decided to make a change. I was done with being a vegetarian. Maria number 3 made me a chicken burger. Una hamburguesa de pollo, in the local parlance. It wasn't bad. Emboldened, we went to a bar the next day and had boquerones en vinagre. Okay, so it turns out that raw anchovies cured in vinegar aren't a great reintroduction to seafood after years away. Or I should say, after years without trying any sort of fish. Sort of gummy in texture and very fishy in taste, I would only come to love them much later. Back in Madrid, I signed up for a boxing gym. I had a friend who was doing it, and for years I'd mostly felt like punching someone in the face, so it seemed like a logical step. My boxing coach told me I needed to gain some weight. He gave me some dietary advice. Carne de caballo for its low-fat content, atún en escabeche because he thought there was something about the mix of oil and vinegar that would make me put on muscle. And chorizo, for reasons I've since forgotten. I wasn't quite ready to eat horse meat, but I tried the tuna with some sliced tomato. It was pretty good. We were getting somewhere with this whole non-veg thing. I felt a bit better. And then, one day, after a hard training session, I was in the mood for something different. I stopped off at a butcher's shop on my way back home from the gym and bought a couple of links of spicy red chorizo. Getting home, I fried it and put it between 2 pieces of baguette. I took a bite. Holy fuck. I remember it like it was yesterday. The effect was immediate. Something was happening in my brain that hadn't happened in several years at that point. It was like the black clouds parting to reveal a bright spring sun as my synapses flooded with cholesterol. For the first time in years, I actually felt good. Mr. Zanahoria was gone, and good riddance. That day, to no fanfare whatsoever, Mr. Chorizo was born. Not in a manger, but in a tiny, shared flat kitchen in Vallecas. A few years later, I learned that humans are, biologically speaking, omnivores, and that the human brain is mostly made of fat. That would have been nice to know as a teenager. But the science deniers over at People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals had been telling me I was basically designed to live on fiber for the last several years. Thanks for nothing, PETA. It's possible that I'd learned I was an omnivore in elementary school science class or something, but I'd since forgotten. Either way, my main takeaway from 13 plus years of quote-unquote education was a hatred for all authority. Maybe that explains why I was hanging out at the anarchist book fair. But that's a story for another day. After that day eating chorizo in Vallecas, I was a changed man. There was no going back to vegetarianism. I was all in. I bought panceta, pork belly, and fried it with eggs. I started going to a bar called Casa Tony and discovered oreja de cerdo, pig's ear, in hot sauce. Amazing. Cartilagey and fatty and spicy and delicious. I went nuts. That summer, Maria number 3 having dumped me at some point, 2 friends invited me to stay with them up in Santander. They took me to every restaurant in town and introduced me to dozens of Spanish foods I'd had no idea existed. Morcilla, that's blood sausage, or black pudding if you're Britishly inclined. It's fried in a bit of flour. It's great. Rabo de toro, that's stewed bull's tail, best served at the bars near a bull ring. Cocido montañés, a stew made with white beans and several kinds of pork, best served by a real Spanish grandmother. I was hooked on cholesterol and finally eating a diet with adequate protein. And I felt great. Anyway, this was supposed to be a list post. I was going to give you my top 10 weird Spanish foods and tell you that you should try them on your next trip to Spain. Then I started writing and things went sideways. I also started getting hungrier and hungrier. And this is what I ended up with. Oh well, what's so great about list posts anyway? These days, I look back on those depressing years in my late teens and early 20s as being a huge mistake. I was mostly vegetarian for social reasons. Everybody else was doing it, and they all claimed to feel great. On the other hand, what else are you going to say? One friend back in those days was an obese vegan who lived on a steady diet of 44-ounce cups of Dr. Pepper, tofu, and, get this, Pop-Tarts. She'd figured out that the frosting on most Pop-Tarts had gelatin, and so they were not vegan. But the unfrosted strawberry and blueberry flavors were animal product free. Her weight problem was genetic, she said, because obviously Dr. Pepper has no fat in it, and her Pop-Tarts were a healthy, fully vegan option, part of a balanced diet. So of course, she claimed she felt great. But what does that even mean? Had she previously been an athletic omnivore for some comparison? En fin, I love Spanish cuisine. These days, I'm feeling pretty good myself. Life after vegetarianism hasn't been all sunshine and roses, but I don't have any qualms about being an omnivore. And Spain's a good place to be one. Here in Barcelona, for example, a lot of the fruits, vegetables, eggs, and meat that I buy are kilometro cero, basically grown locally so they're more sustainable, rather than being shipped in from across the country or the planet. Also, I love Spanish cuisine. From the pescado frito down south in Malaga to the pulpo a la gallega up in A Coruña, and passing, of course, through the many regions along the way, I love all of it. I recommend you try all the foods I've mentioned here and more. Can you believe I haven't said anything about Madrid classics like callos a la madrileña, sort of a tripe stew, and bocadillo de calamares, the famous squid sandwich? That's a pretty big oversight, I admit. I guess I might have to make that list post one day after all. Hungrily yours, Daniel, also known as Mr. Chorizo, because Mr. Zanahoria is dead. That's about all I've got for today. If you like this, you might enjoy my website, expatmadrid.com. Over there, I've got an article about ordering wine in Spain. It's more informational. It has plenty of vocabulary you can use to get a glass of red, white, or bubbly. And also over there, I talk about restaurants from time to time. If you're looking for something more international, I have a list of my favorite international restaurants in Barcelona. Other than that, just a couple of end notes. Often, vegetarians and vegans don't really like my argument that I'm a biological omnivore, and trying to get by on roughage for several years made me really, really depressed. They say I was probably just not doing vegetarianism right. To them, I say, read The Vegetarian Myth. It's a book. Then get back to me. Finally, I would like to note I did eventually eat that horse meat that my boxing coach recommended. Actually, I spent several years eating horse meat, and that's one of the topics in my recent article and podcast about Spain's Great Recession. If you're here on the podcast, you can listen to that. It's episode 22. It talks quite a bit about the Great Recession, and I believe the horse meat even makes it into the podcast. Well, that's it. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed listening to this as much as I enjoyed writing the article and, of course, narrating it. I hope you have a great day wherever it is that you are in the world. From beautiful but very rainy Barcelona. Hasta la próxima. Bye. Thanks for listening to this podcast. For much more, you can head over to expatmadrid.com, where I write articles about all things Spain. You can donate to the cause at expatmadrid.com/donate. You could also subscribe to this podcast wherever it is you're listening, or over at the website, enter your email address for future updates. I hope you have a great day wherever you are in the world, and stay tuned for more Spain. Hasta la próxima, and bye.